For some reason, there are really bright lights in the corners, so I can't see any of you. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's on purpose, so I guess I won't ask you any questions. Yeah, I'm sure it's for that. Just so you know, I can't really see you. Um, that's better. All right. So what we're doing today is we tried to put together a little series on Mary. I'm not sure. I don't know the status of what's happening next week because it's the Wednesday before Canuga, and apparently that's a really it's a busy week in our lives. So I don't know if what happens to people being able to show up here. But we put a series together to talk about Mary as we get closer to Advent. So for obvious reasons, Mary is associated with Advent, right? That Mary would have something to do with Jesus appearing on the scene at Christmas. But the readings for Advent and the collects for Advent are actually about the end of time. And they're kind of hinting at a second coming. And so you probably noticed in December that you're starting to read, all of a sudden you're hearing about darkness and kind of chaos and violence and war and apocalypse. And then and it's projecting a second coming, that Jesus returns. But then we conclude that season with Christmas. Jesus shows up for the first time. And so we don't really get a Marian season, right? Some people try to work a couple of Mary things into Advent. So we thought we'd just get ahead of it and do it now as a way to get us all ready so we can enjoy Advent for all it is. And what I wanted to talk about today, and I really want to have a conversation and just tell you some stories of some interesting ideas about Mary, Mary is often, in almost every culture, it's very clear that Mary is acculturated, so made to be contextual or part of the place that tells the story of Mary, in a way that Jesus isn't necessarily, right? Jesus actually, one because of colonialism, but also for some other reasons, Jesus looks fairly similar around the world. And sometimes you'll see an acculturated Jesus, and we've talked about that here. What should Jesus look like in this community? Or what are the ways that Jesus should look? But in general, you kind of get the same character in most of the world. Mary, on the other hand, is almost immediately acculturated or contextualized everywhere, and you almost can't stop it. People have Mary become one of them as soon as you get a Mary. And so I come from one of those communities that absolutely made Mary a local as soon as they got her. And our story is that we don't know, truth is a big word, right? That Thomas comes to India and brings Christianity to our part of India. So Mary would have come like right first century, second century as an idea. So when you think about Guadalupe, right? You can think of contextualized Marys without seeing an image. Who can think of another Mary? Or a description of Mary, an image of Mary, just off the top of your head?
Icons in Russia?
Yep, Russian icons, yep. Yep, yep, they're beautiful Native American images of Mary. And then Guadalupe is the one that most of us know, right, in Mexico City, and sometimes called Mary of the Americas. It's when Mary and there's usually a story like this, a vision or something like that. So through the story of a vision is made, the shrine is developed for her outside of Mexico City. So Shakti is an Indian word for power. So if I literally was just talking about power in Malayalam and Hindi, I would actually use the word Shakti. Shakti means power. The roots of the word Shakti are the power of the goddess. So it's very specifically a feminine power, but just like using the Oxford English Dictionary, something like that, there are roots of words that don't necessarily, we're not necessarily trying to carry all that meaning. We use the word, but if you do the work, that's what's under there. So Shakti literally is the power of the goddess, which then leads someone like me, who is an American, to wonder what the power of the goddess is. Like, what is that? We don't have that in this culture. We don't have it in Christianity. So Shakti is the power of the goddess. Mary is contextualized all over the world. When my grandmother died, which is 5 years ago now, 5 or 6 years ago, we happened to be there. We got there before she died, and I can't remember how this happened, but I had her pillow, and I think it was that she had literally just died, and someone was putting her head down or something like that, and they passed off something to someone standing. I was the person standing around. I got this pillow, and there were these lumps in the bottom of the pillow. There's something in it. So I stuck my hand in to figure out what they were. In that way, when something really important is happening, you don't know what to do, right? Like my grandmother's just died, she's lying in this bed, and I'm fidgeting with her pillow. Take these two things out, and they're just two little packets like that of white fabric around something, like something's wrapped up. It looks like a Hershey's Kiss. And she is a woman that would have worn white her whole life, and these very simple Indian cottons. And so the kind of simple cotton that if we had an oil lamp right there and you needed a wick, she would just pull a little string off and put it on and burn the wick. If you need a little fabric, you tear off a little bit, whatever. So that's what she had clearly done. It was from her clothes, something is wrapped up. So I start to undo it. Again, I can't imagine why I'm doing this when my grandmother has just died right there and is still there. And my mother put her hand very gently over my hand to stop me. So I asked her what they were. And she said, they're for the church. It's an offering that you make at death. And she had them ready in her pillow. It's like, well, that's amazing, right? And we know our church. We go to, is this one place we all go? And I asked her why there were two. And she said, well, one is for the temple. So just to backtrack, right? My mother's family is Syrian Orthodox. That's called Jacobite, where they are from. They are Christian. Our church is St. Mary's Orthodox Cathedral in Mannergod, which is a town that my grandmother is from. It's a walk from the town she lives in. Makes sense to me that there would be some kind of neat token gift that you make to that cathedral on your way out, because it's the kind of cathedral where you can pick up a little foot or a hand and put it in the box and someone will say a prayer. Like, it's that kind of shrine. So it totally made sense that you would drop something off there at the end. But we don't go to the temple. The temple is the Devi temple. It's a Hindu temple, and it's a temple to the goddess. And it's about 1 kilometer from the church, right? It's a very easy walk. I'd seen the sign for it. When you come up to town and come up to the place where you can go this way or that way is the church, that way is the temple. There's a picture of literally of the deity, right? There's the goddess, you go that way. There's Mary and Jesus, and it's classic European Mary. The only thing that way you'd know that we might be in India is Mary's hair coloring is dark, her eyes are kind of dark, and Jesus has a big full head of black curly hair. Like, Jesus is clearly one of us, right? And it could be Krishna. That's what the image looks like, right? Completely acculturated, but kind of invisible to me because this is our church. And then there's the goddess going that way, and she's not that different than the lady with the baby over here, right? So I don't know what to do, but I take a picture of the things. It seems interesting, and I don't think about it again. But when I got home, I looked up what that was. Right? What does the temple have to do with the church? And why would someone like my grandmother, there's no conversion story in that family, right? They would have said they've been Christians as long as there have been Christians here. Her family, my mother's family, have been priests for many generations in that church, that actual place. And we go there, we know them, we know there's not a mix of practices, because that would be cool. I think we'd all think that was really interesting, but we're not cool like that. We just go to the cathedral, we say our prayers. So I found an article by William Dalrymple, who is an Indian historian from the UK, I guess you can tell by his name, who spent his life working on primary documents in India and doing Indian history. And so at some point he gets interested in this story and comes down to Kerala and writes a magazine article, but he takes it from the other side, that there's this temple in Kerala, and there's many of these kinds of stories, he says, that has this relationship with this church. And what is it? And the way he does it is for the big processional, the festival for the goddess at the temple, that's when he's there. You've probably actually seen this if there's a Hare Krishna temple here. You take out the image, you take out as many images as you have, very much like a Catholic procession, right? Maybe, I don't know if we do one, if we have a picture. You take out the cows and the elephants, whatever you got, right? You take out your animals, take out the people, you take out the drums, you walk through the town. The whole town. It's kind of saying this is her place. And people open their doors, people stand at their gates, people offer flowers, people light candles. Everyone kind of honors that this important procession is coming through the town. So he goes to that and he talks to the people, because that entire little town where my grandmother's from are Hindu and Christian. They're Jacobites and Christians. Nobody else lives there, probably because our shrines are there, right? And so he's asking why the Christian women are sitting there watching this thing. And they're like, oh, well, we respect each other's religion, and these are our neighbors, and they say all kinds of very nice things like that. And you ask the Hindu women about the procession, they say it's their procession. you ask the Hindu women, what is the relationship between the church and the temple? Because isn't it interesting that everyone's come out for this and everyone's standing outside? And they said, oh, well, the deities, the goddesses are sisters. He's like, well, what goddesses, right? And they're like, well, Mary and the Devi are sisters. And then they tell a story. And this is a story my mother has told me, that at some time of great conflict, there was a war near our town, and two sisters are fleeing from this war, and so they run to the temple for shelter because no one is going to attack a temple. It's a holy place. But there's not enough space there. So they decide to split up, and one stays there, and the other one runs to the church. And they're both safe, and so we honor that they were both kept safe. So that's interesting, but it seems like a little too small a story, right? To have Hindu-Christian cooperation in this way. So the more I keep poking at these stories, I get a story that when the temple was built, they had elephants, they build the temple. So when the Christians decide that they're going to build a church, they bring the same elephants to raise the cross. But a story of elephants doesn't really make sense to me either. So the last time I was there, I went to the temple and just asked, because it's a neighborhood I know, what's the connection? But it wasn't the first. So my first question was, what a great temple, let's look around. So we saw the temple, we talked to people. There's a goddess in the temple, it's really cool. I asked for the story of the temple, and they say, what was it? Whenever, and this is the story of that community, that at some time when there's a great storm and there's violence off on the coast where we all come from, which is a prime trading place, right? It's where Vasco da Gama landed. It's supposedly where Columbus was trying to come, that we had to leave in a time of great conflict, and when we left, the goddess came with us. It's like, well, what does that mean? Like an umbrella, a symbol, like, what does it mean? It's like, no, she came with us. It's like you took the statue? She was like, no, our ancestors tell us she came with us, and so we've built this place, right? So they have a shrine to the goddess that came with them when they fled from the place they're from. So what's coming to my mind at that point is we're from that place as well. That's the story of our community. We were also up there. Thomas came to that place. It's how we all end up in Kotem. So I say to this guy, because he seems, and the story just gets, every question I ask, I understand less, right? Somehow the goddess has come to our town. Clearly we were with those people because that's our story too. That's how we get to this town, because we're from up there. The goddess has come, they've set up a shrine. Everyone recognizes the power of that goddess. People insist there must be a place for the goddess to be worshipped. And this is old school, right? We're in the South, so South India. So there's a shrine for the cobra where you feed the snake. If you don't have a grove for a snake, things aren't going to go well in your community, right? Then there's the goddess temple. So I asked him, what is the relationship between the church and the temple? And at this point, I'm just assuming he thinks there's one, right? So I ask him, and he says, oh, yeah, those are our people. So he's talking about me at this point, right? Like, those are our people. When they came here, they really wanted a place for Mary. And so we've rented them a place so they can have a place, but they still pay us a rent. Like, those are our people. We're the same people. I'm like, right? Fascinating. So then I go to the church, and that's my church. Like, I was a child. We all feel very connected to this church. So I go there and ask, and I go to the office. I'm a priest, so I feel very confident walking into the church office, and it's all these like clergy in their black cassocks. And I get the like Scott Inman, I get the lay leader, right? And I was like, oh, he's gonna be. So I ask him, I ask him about the festival, say that my family's from this church and my grandmother's from this church, and it's like, but I'm trying to understand what the connection is between the church and the temple. And he looks at me and says, there's no connection. And I was like, well, but there's this article, and then my grandmother had these things, and I just went over there, and he said, are you a journalist? Okay. Yeah. And he's like, well, no. He's like, well, what are you? I was like, I'm a tourist, and my grandmother goes to church here. He was really angry about it. So clearly there's something there, which is very exciting to me. So then I went to talk to a professor about it, who said, and they didn't wrap it up neatly, but said that there is a 7-day festival in this cathedral, which I know about because we've been to this, and I took my parents later, and you can see at that festival that almost everyone that comes is Hindu, though many of our own people come, and we take it as a very important day of 7 days of fasting that's broken by a celebration at the end. And in that fasting, and our fasting is very nice fasting, like there's food, you just don't eat like meat, but they're making food for you, you stay there and fast. Very, very Indian style of fasting, right? And everyone stays there together. You say prayers and whatever. So you do that for all those days, and people come with serious intentions. Like you can see people carrying people who are physically unable or sick. People living with mental illness often have sometimes their families will take them there to ask for prayers. It's very earnest and serious. People parade around the church with these umbrellas, which is the symbol of those prayers, which is why I thought that's how the goddess had come from up north. To make kind of with their discipline to do the hard thing, to show their devotion, and literally they're sort of pleading for Mary to hear them. The church is to Mary, right? So he says, Hindus come, Christians come, Muslims come, Catholics come, Orthodox people come, not a lot of Protestants come, but everybody comes because there's power there, is what he said. So I asked him, what power, like what are we talking about? Like what, why would everybody come? And he said, the way you are talking about who Mary is sounds to me like you think Mary is different than the Devi, like it's different. That Jesus is different than these gods. And I was like, well, yeah, and you're a Christian too, don't we think it's different? And he said, no one here is going to tell you that it's different. What people here will tell you is this is our custom, and this is their custom, and they have power. So I find this fascinating. I don't have an answer at the end of this. I just find it so interesting that Christians, I don't find it confusing or interesting that Hindus would say, this makes sense. That actually works within the framework of of how Hinduism works. But for Christians, like my grandmother, to believe that she's going to drop a token off that my uncle has to go drop a token off at the temple, kind of an acknowledgement of her life, which is what those tokens are, has begun a little bit of a search for me to try to understand how Mary works around the world, who Mary is, and how we claim Mary. And I think for those of us that are Protestants, we've lost out on something because the Catholic tradition and the Orthodox tradition, Mary's right at the heart of it, sometimes in very problematic ways, but a lot of times in really powerful ways. Like, right, Mexico City is not a secondary shrine, right? Like that is the primary shrine for Christians in Mexico. And that's actually true all over the world, that the Marian shrines are more powerful than other kinds of shrines, or they're understood to be more powerful sites of devotion. So one point of analysis around that, for some people, one way of understanding it, is that we all come from traditions that had some kind of goddess or earth-centered worship way long ago. I'm sure you've all had classes around that here at St. Luke's, that religion looked like that all over the world, and you still see faith practice and religious practice that looks like that in many, many parts of the world, and that what we lose in losing Mary is access to that. And what we have in Mary is, and the church is very good at this, when we see a thing that works, we're happy to claim it. There's lots of stuff like that. That what we have in claiming Mary is still access to those practices. That it is acknowledged that the oldest religious practices recorded are kind of a crying out to the sun, or a crying out, to power. Like we feel powerless, or we are powerless over something that's just happened. What is there is there something to call out to? That will save us, that protects us. And a lot of our prayers still sound like that, right? We have a lot of theology around that, but our prayers still often sound like that. Part of what's happening in this place in Kerala, which I find fascinating, and the reason I call it Mary Has the Shakti, is there's an interview with a woman who's at the temple, at the church, and someone says, why do you come in this interview to this festival? Why do you come to this place? You're not Christian. And she says, Mary has the Shakti, which I think is an amazing sentence. She says, as a Hindu woman that goes to that temple, Mary has power. In her understanding, your goddess has power. So what I find fascinating about that is I don't know that we think our goddess has any power, right? Isn't that interesting? But she sees something in what is held in Mary. So what's at that site is just a church. It looks like a regular church. It's big, and it's a huge pilgrimage site. And then at the very front of the church, so behind, like where we have our Jesus up on the wall up high, it's closed, very much like a temple would be. It's a closed image. It's sort of a triptych. And it's open at the end of that festival for 14 days, or sometimes 7 days. And they just open it up, and all you see in there is that Mary with the Jesus with all the hair, right? That's in there, and some lights. And the day that's open, we were there one year, people literally leap forward, surge forward, throw things to try to get somewhere near this image. And you would think you were in a Hindu temple, but you're in an Orthodox church And if you think we're formal, Orthodoxy is formal, right? You are in a formal Orthodox church, but you're in the south of India. So what I want to talk about, what I want you to think about is religion is always contextualized. And sometimes it helps to think about someone else's context and to hear a story that's really far away, to give you tools to see how we are contextualized, that we too are defined and define our own faith by the culture we live in. Right? By the values of the culture. One of the ways we've all seen that recently, I know, is, and I know this church has talked about this for a long time, but recently I know Ed has raised it again, is when we talk about race, we see how we're enculturated, how we enculturate our faith to our culture, right? Our faith isn't racist. Jesus isn't racist, right? Our Bible has some very problematic statements in it, but we have lots of problematic things in the Bible that we don't submit to, right? We shift. But we live in a culture that orders itself in a particular way, and we have made our religion to fit it. And it takes work to shift that, right? And it's really hard to see when it sits within your own culture. So I'm going to bring Mary back into the conversation a couple of times as we all go forward, because she really helps that. This Mary, and Mary with the Shakti, because it's so, frankly, odd and distinct and different, helps us to see, I think, and illustrates how much we form our religion by the culture we live in, and then the other side of that, how much religious power and force and belief, faith, is in our communities that is trying to emerge in our religion, in our practice of religion, and we would be wise, I think, to watch for it, right? That people are looking to this place for ways to worship, for ways to appeal to God, for ways to find meaning. And part of the point of a place like this is how can we be enculturated? And it doesn't mean the same thing in every generation, and it doesn't mean the same thing in every community. So we'd have to then think about who we appeal to, who we want to be appealing to, who we want to meet, and what cries for truth, for justice, for hope can we imagine that this place can speak to. So there are a lot of ways to think about this, Mary, that I've just said, right? One is just enculturation. And so if Christianity had come to India in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 19th century, then yes, enculturation. Mary came with missionaries, and Indians tried to make sense of her, right? Fine. But that's not actually how we tell our story. We say that Thomas came, and then the church was established. And so Mary would have been known to this community. I mean, if their story is true, by someone who knew Mary, right? Thomas would have known her, which is just blows my mind. So this would have been a person that had lived with this person. These are stories of people that would have known each other in this context so far away from them, here in India, so far from the Middle East, understanding them as teachers, and then over time, it's not clear when, understanding them to be God, right, to be revelations of the divine, and then fitting Mary into that. And the way they fit Mary into that is, well, she must be a goddess. If he's a god, if her son is a god, she would have to be a goddess. And let me just pause there, because I feel like I've just told you a really weird story. Tell me what you're thinking and what you think. And so one, we can do a round of what you think, and then I want to hear, so let's do that. And then depending on where that goes, I'd like to hear what you think of Mary, what you know about Mary. And then we'll go from there. So what are you thinking? I'm going to just put out there, this is an odd story. Odd story in India.
I have a couple of Mary icons, and for some reason, just sitting with them is very calming. There's something about knowing who she was and how she was so willing to, and so it's fine with me to have this baby.
Yeah.
Just say, yes, I'll do that. But there's something about the icons. I got one at Notre Dame in Paris, and then one from a convent in Augusta, Georgia, an Episcopal convent. David, this young woman, one of the women did an icon. And I just find them, they bring me peace. And I don't know why.
And you got them, so you said you got them in Augusta, is that right?
I got one in Augusta.
Yeah.
And one in Paris at Notre Dame.
Yeah.
The one from the
Right.
the Episcopal nuns in Augusta.
Yep.
So I got one of them there.
Yep. and they bring you peace. You said. Yeah.
Just looking at them, if I could sit meditating with them, they bring me peace. And I don't know.
You should assume I can't see your hand, so if you want to say something, just go for it. I think that's really interesting that you're talking about looking at an image, because that's also that's the place where it's the image. That's fascinating.
I grew up Catholic, so we said prayers to Mary and everything. And when I became Episcopalian, it was looked at, from what I could tell, that was making false gods. There's only one God, and Mary wasn't to be prayed to. But I find when I'm stressed out or scared to death or, whatever,
Huh.
I say Jesus, Mary, Joseph, just because what you learned
Yeah.
early,
Yeah.
But, and I wondered why there are two goddesses and what that,
Yeah. That they're sisters. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, so I think this is, it's an interesting thing about the Episcopal Church. We're one of the few traditions, I'm sure there's some others, but I'm not aware of them really, that we're one of the few traditions that hold within it the capacity to, to revere saints or to revere Mary and to not equally. For most Protestants, that's a line in the sand, right? And it's really not for us. Though some Episcopalians feel more strongly about it than others. In the Orthodox traditions, Mary is the God-bearer, and has a title of power. So we wouldn't use the language of goddesses in our tradition, but God-bearer is pretty close, like really, really close. I think it's us without saying goddess. I don't know, because God, and it's weirdly. It's some of the hang-ups of Western Christians, is that it's almost that we insist on not gendering it unless it's male, right? Because God-bearer is just to be clear, it's a very significant role, right? And so we might be one of the few traditions where you will find people that would absolutely say, no, we're not like Roman Catholics in that way, and many, like me, that would say, yes, in every Episcopal church you go into, there's a Mary window right there. Even the most Protestant ones I've been in, we have them too. It's always the same spot, and it comes from that practice that we come out of the Roman Catholic Church, not with a huge doctrinal difference, but claiming a language and national border, basically, is who Anglicans are. And so all those Marian devotions are very much a part of our tradition and heritage. And I don't know how to put Joseph into that, but what you talk about and kind of when you really need prayer, or when you're really calling out, what you cry out to is exactly how they talk about her in that place, that she's the one that, and they don't necessarily say that she answers, but they say that she's the one that you cry out to, which is, again, fascinating to me.
Well, I also grew up Catholic, like Noreen, and so I remember, because Mary being very central to the Catholic Church. There's always icons of her in every Catholic church that I can remember. And even in confession, when you would go to confession, and so to get absolution, they would say five mother, five
Yeah.
Our Fathers, 10 Hail Marys, whatever. So Mary always seemed to be so central to my growing up as a Catholic, and kind of one of the reasons I'm here is to try to understand why is Mary so absent in the Episcopalian Church?
Yeah.
Because I don't get that sense of her presence at all.
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you go to an Anglo-Catholic church, it's not true. So if you're in an Anglo-Catholic church, which is interesting because this is changing too, but that's not necessarily the most friendly place for women, right? Though that's changing, right? But there's always going to be a Mary window there, and probably a chapel as well, and a pretty high devotion to Mary, which again is just fascinating, as though she has no gender in a space that has not, in recent history, been kind to women. Fascinating. And so the more Protestant side of the church, or the broad side of the church, which is where most of us land, we're a little ambivalent. But where you've seen it come back and kind of re-enter the rest of the church is as we've done outreach to people, particularly from Mexico, but from Central America, Guadalupe has brought her back. right? That the version of Guadalupe, because we want to be inclusive, we want to be thoughtful about kind of a local aesthetic and making our churches accessible, there Guadalupe goes up on the wall, and all of a sudden we've got Mary, right? And she's back in this very indigenized, localized, contextual way, right? We don't, and that is actually, I think that's actually brought Mary back on this other side of the church, almost across the country, which is also a whole complicated thing because Mary is a nationalist symbol in Mexico, Guadalupe is, and that's not, I think, what any of our churches expect to be communicating. We're trying to be accessible. But it points to the fact that every culture you go to that is Christian has indigenized their Mary. That the idea of a mother goddess, a mother character is just so a part of who we are, I think, as human beings, that if you give us a way to make that character, we'll make it. It's everywhere, and they're beautiful. And there's nothing in our prayer book that prevents us from honoring that.
I was going to say, if you listen to the anthems from now until the end of the year, you'll hear lots.
Do you think the anthems for Advent have a lot of Mary in them, is what I just heard? Yeah.
And also some of the anthems about All Saints' Day, and
Yep.
because when we sing about the saints, once you get done with the angels and stuff, the next one that comes is the prophets and the martyrs, but the first one they mention is Mary.
Yeah.
When they have this list of people that they're talking about, singing God, the first one is always Mary.
One of the other reasons I think it's important to raise her at least once a year for us to think about her is a lot of the early church gave Mary a very prominent position, and we miss it because we're not kind of attuned to looking at it. But in early images, even of the story of Pentecost, when they first gather back around that table, when Jesus is missing, right? The image is like, there's the Last Supper, there's everybody, there's Jesus. Jesus is gone. Mary's often in that place, not Peter. You can see it throughout Mary has a very, very prominent role in the early church. The story of even that cathedral in India is that how does Mary die becomes the question. Like what do you do with Mary at the end of the story? So there are multiple versions of the end. One is that John, the beloved disciple, and Mary go to Ephesus and die there. And there is a place that is the tomb of Mary and John in Ephesus, and there's literally two things next to each other as those things go. So there's that. The other version of the story is the ascension of Mary, is that Mary dies, and the art around that as well, you could be at the Last Supper. It's almost exactly the same setup, except that it's Mary lying on her deathbed. And there are all the disciples, well, the ones that are left, right around there. And then she ascends, is what they say, that she dies and she ascends, that her body is not corrupted. And this is an early doctrine of the church. And so in her ascension, this is a hilarious side story, right? Thomas apparently wasn't there. As Thomas has that problem in other stories as well. He's not in the spot at the right time. And we know that Thomas doesn't believe people. So Mary, noting these things as she's ascending, apparently looks down and sees him. This is a written story. It's pretty amazing. And drops her, her cincture, basically, drops her rope girdle so that he'll look up and notice, so that he'll know that she's ascended, that they haven't lost her like they lost Jesus, right? And that is actually a relic that's held in the Orthodox churches. They've torn this thing up and spread it around. But at the very least, what it does is it tells this. It's a way to tell the story of the ascension of Mary, that her body would remain. That she returns in her bodily form, basically, or remains with Jesus. Which again points to how in the early church, Mary was a very, very important character. That's not happening to Peter or to Paul, right? They're martyred. Mary was very important in the founding of, as we understand ourselves. And Eucharistically, like some would say, it has been said, the first who can say, "This is my body, this is my blood," is Mary. Mary is the icon of the priest. But a lot of that is lost to us, right? A lot of that is lost to us as Protestants.
Sometime in Advent week, there's a pink candle
Yeah.
for Mary.
Yep.
And I think we've done it before.
Yep. Yeah, there's definitely
There's Mary Sunday.
there's a Sunday in Advent that is for Mary. Yeah, there can be. It's maybe a better way to say it. And I think the way that's changed is because literally because people have to sell these things through church catalogs, and some churches do it and some churches don't. How they market that has influenced what we think we do for Advent. Yeah, so yes, I grew up with there's a Marian Sunday, and you don't necessarily see those anymore.
Well, also our move towards blue
Yeah,
in Advent
yeah, and
is the color.
is Mary. Yeah, is Mary. Yeah. Yeah, the reason there's an Advent blue is there were just parts of the church that used blue instead of purple. And I think the Northern European parts of the church, there's just certain parts of the church that culturally did. I think for a lot of us, we like the distinction, like we're not in Lent, to do something different than Lent for Advent. And then blue it's the color of Israel. It's the color of, there are a lot of reasons why it really works for thinking about the physicality of Jesus and the physicality of those stories. But blue is absolutely Mary's color.
For me, especially this year, Mary has become more and more an image of us, like the story about how we are with Jesus. Because, I mean, if you believe, I mean, one of the most prominent Christmas hymns is for Jesus to be born in us today.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
if you believe, if your spirituality is centered around Jesus being born in you, then Mary is the one who consented to having Jesus born in her.
Yep.
And that consent, of course, is necessary for us.
Yep, absolutely. I think it's one of the reasons it's important that Mary's contextualized, right? That she's not, because I think one kind of perversion of it is that she's so different than us, that it has nothing to do with a body or a woman or childbirth. But I think actually the point of the story is, those of us that are reading Ruth together, right? That Mary's a product of a complicated story and a complicated lineage, and the Bible tells us that. They tell us this is a really gritty, grimy story of heritage, and then a baby is born, and we are not, Aquinas believing that there's nothing to that. Like a baby doesn't get put in it's not like a shoebox that you pull a baby out of, right? Like a baby is of the material of the body of the mother, and the baby is changed and the mother is changed by the existence of this baby. Like we understand that much better than those that wrote some of the theology of Mary. And so then to understand that and take that seriously says a lot about who we are and what we can hold and what is redeemable. And I think in really, really powerful ways she symbolizes that. What else? What else about Mary? Is there any? Yes. Yeah, yes, right? I think one of the challenges of reading the stories of the Bible for us in the ways that we live is that we're talking about a time when life is so different and difficult in a way that it is still in most of the world, right? For the majority of humans on this planet, life looks more like that than like ours. And it's so complicated that we're the ones that produce theology, frankly, because the people for whom that story probably is most resonant and feels like real life will not get to tell us how to think about Jesus in a way that we're going to ever hear. We tell, right? And so there's so much to that is probably lost to us because we cannot imagine that lived reality, while there are people living some version of that lived reality all around us, right? And Mary reminds us of that. In the story of the place that I come from, what's interesting to me is the goddess stories I know and that are in the dominant form of Hinduism. So what I learned at school, they're all just heroic. Like they were born the descendant of a god and they married gods. And if anything, people were a little bit like frisky, but basically everything was like within the royal families, right? Like it was the god world. But in Kerala, that goddess tradition, none of those characters are those goddesses. So in the kind of nationalism that's happening in India right now, they're trying to they're saying it, what do they say, saffron wash all of it? Like trying to take away these local stories and have everything be these more dominant stories that you read about in the Gitas and other places. But the truth of those places is you go in and talk to them, like the guy that I went to talk to, there is no goddess there with a name that I recognized from my religious studies degree. These are local characters, and every one of them has a story pretty comparable to Mary, like just done wrong. Something has gone wrong. They are mad. One thing I love about them is they're angry. Like they're not docile characters. Things went wrong, and in their outrage, they become goddesses, which is amazing. Like it literally, they're called the raging goddesses of Kerala, and they all have different stories. What I wondered, I'd love to spend some time talking to people in India about this, is how does that cause them to think of Mary? So we've been told that she's meek and mild. The Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says almost nothing. But if you grew up in this place where you've got that people become goddesses because things have happened in this way, and everybody goes to the temple and you make sure you make the sacrifice because you don't want her to be mad, right? And that's also where you go if you need something, because if she's on your side, you got it. I wonder how they hear Mary. I'm guessing they imagine Mary very differently than we do, and probably in some ways that would be useful for us, is my guess. And I wonder how they imagine her son, right? Like,
I would think that Mary would have spent a lot of time being angry.
interesting.
She would have expected him, she would have had a reasonable expectation for him to stay at home and support her. And,
That's actually in the Bible that she expects that and has trouble with his decisions. Yes.
and she wants him to come home,
Yeah.
and he disses her, completely.
Yes, he does.
And,
It's pretty brutal, right? Yeah. It's a pretty brutal passage when he does. Yeah.
it is. I mean, if you're Mary, it's like really.
Yeah.
And so I would think that there was a lot of difficulty and struggle in her in terms of, obviously in the end she does accept Jesus because she's there. She shows up when he's crucified. But that struggle to accept him when a lot of her reasonable expectations of how to sustain herself, were betrayed.
And it seems to me, yes, and at the very least, even just to protect him,
Yeah.
right? That's,
One of my favorite stories of Mary and Jesus is when they're coming back from a festival,
yeah.
and the whole family is going back, and Jesus stays behind, and they don't know where he is, and they're going nuts. I can totally relate to that story. I'm there with Mary, I'm pissed off, and I don't care if he's Jesus. It's like I am really, really scared because I'm thinking I lost you.
Yeah.
And it's on that very kind of level as a mother.
Yeah.
Because I've got children myself that I relate to Mary. And when I read that story, I said, she's a real person. I can relate to her. She's not just an icon in a church.
Yeah.
She's really living a life. Jesus is real, and she is real. And
Yeah.
she's reacting as any mother would
Yeah.
when a child just,
Yep. Yeah.
doesn't follow rules and just disappears on her.
Yeah. And Jesus acts like a child that has gone off too. They both are very much in character, right? Well, I think so. I think one of the reasons it's important to have Mary is to your notion of peace. I mean, there've been some studies around this that a recent one was done in a synagogue, and it's amazing that in just changing the pronouns and the imagery for God in their synagogue, all of these women said they had very, very different experiences of prayer and of the liturgy. People that, I mean, this wasn't like a class of like feminist synagogue goers. They weren't people that thought there was a lack necessarily in what they were doing, but in being given an image that was frankly more, and this was like fast, so this wasn't like there was a class on why this should matter to you, but almost instantaneously people identified with with this idea that, oh, God like me, God that might understand me, right? God that might see me, or that holiness is in me, that people responded quickly to how jarring and then how comforting, how upsetting that was. It was a big change. And Mary, I think for Roman Catholic women in particular, and for Orthodox women, has fulfilled that role. So I don't know any Roman women or Orthodox women that would say that Mary is God, but Mary's enough. Like there we are, right? It sanctifies our living and reflects our living in a way that God as man and Jesus, who is a man, does for men, probably without ever thinking about it. Right? It's just the nature of how we gender ourselves and how we gender the way we live in the world. And so it just becomes, to me, intriguing if we can offer ourselves ways to understand that the divine life that God sees us and knows our experience and desires to. It changes our relationship to ourselves and to God. And Mary's one of those tools towards that. And you see it because everywhere you put a Mary, people make her like them. Like people immediately get what you do to that in a way that maybe Jesus is a little bit too far from us because we should do the same, right? We should do absolutely the same. That's what I wanted to say about Mary today. Any thoughts or questions or ideas, or we can be done.
I was one of those Episcopalians who prayed to all saints. So I was growing up, and I didn't ever see anything wrong with it. But Mary's always been kind of confusing to me because on one hand, I've seen her as, icons or pictures or whatever, her crying over Jesus and all of those stories and. I never knew quite where to put her, where she fit in the whole thing. She wasn't like St. Jude, she wasn't like St. Anthony. They all had specific purposes, right?
Yep.
And I don't know what Mary's, other than being the mother of God, which is no small thing, but then why do praying to Mary was like, what is she supposed to do?
All the things. I think Mary does all the things. But yeah. Well, I think you're right that she's undefined because. So this is what kind of academics say about her is that we're ambivalent because there's only one role for her, right? Look, who in all of world religions, who's the mother of God? A goddess. There's no other scenario, right? If God has a mother, right? Usually God doesn't. In many scenarios, God doesn't. But that's our understanding of Jesus is, Jesus is God, right? God's Son is God. And Mary is this intermediary that is either kind of sanctified in the process of bearing Jesus or sanctified so she can bear Jesus or all those things. And it really messes with you if you don't. So Ivone Guevara, she's a Brazilian nun, brilliant theologian. She just says it very bluntly. I think it's as blunt in Portuguese as it is in English. She's like, y'all, if you're looking for a way to do some outreach as Christians, claim Mary as your goddess is going to be the way you do it in my community. Like this is a community that, this is a community of women, is basically what she's saying, of women that are struggling. She works in favelas in Brazil. And if you've got a deity that reflects their experience, and she said, and Mary does, you got them all. Like they will recognize her, which is I didn't know you could. I don't know that you can do that. I don't know that that's within anyone's parameters to do. But she kind of names it. Like here is the person in our story that reflects the experience of everyone she's working with, and we're that ambivalent about her in how we've talked about who she is. Because there's really only one place for her to go if you're going to acknowledge her at all, which is I think a little bit where Protestants go is then just don't acknowledge her because it gets very complicated.
I used to go to a Roman Catholic church with a friend of mine growing up, and now that you mentioned it, when you said the word mediator, that's what
Yeah.
they thought that, Mary, Mother of God, pray for me,
Yeah.
The Roman church I went to was the Immaculate Heart of Mary Church, so, yeah.
Yeah, the thing about Manargat that still intrigues me, and there's a bunch of these St. Mary's churches in all over India, actually, because again, Mary is more compelling. Jesus is kind of confusing in Hinduism, like kind of how that it's not a story of success, frankly, right? So it's a confusing image, confusing story, the crucified God. Mary is not confusing. Like there are shrines to Mary. There's Mary of the Camels in Gujarat. There are all these Marian shrines. She makes sense, which I just find fascinating and wonder how we've lost her so much here when in these cultures where there's no context for her backstory, she absolutely makes sense. And I even think we say mediator because we don't know what to do,
Yeah.
right? Because no tradition believes that you need a mediator, not one. Well, but the Roman Catholic Church, right. When then you get Mary as the first priest. That and literally they will do that with no gender confusion somehow. That Mary is the icon of the priest, but priests can only be men. And yes, you need them to get to the yeah.
One of the things Elizabeth pointed out is that one of the things about Mary is the mystery of her background. We don't know if she, anything about her family, where she came from, except suddenly there's Mary. And maybe I'm thinking we can relate to her because she's sort of not an orphan, but that
Yep.
even though her background is a mystery and all of that, there's still this deity or humanity. There's just something about her that you can attach to, and that's part of her appeal.
Well, and for those of us reading the Ruth story, remember when they returned to Bethlehem?
Right?
I mean, basically, that's how the story starts. They return to Bethlehem, and it's not her place, it's his, right? She returns to Bethlehem as an outsider, just like the Ruth story at the beginning. We don't really know. And her name is Mary. And Naomi says, call me Mara, right? Call me bitter, the bitter one. So there are all these things that story is trying to evoke for us. And in many ways, we talk about the every man. Mary is very much the every woman, right? Like it's a very common experience of a woman. Yes, she has a great mystery. Well, glad to not have solved any of that, and just put out some more ideas to play with as we get closer. Thank you all.